Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm going to be doing a sort of, not a double review, a discussion, a double book wrap-up, a compare and contrast of two books that I thought it was going to be easier for me to talk about this way, sort of in comparison with one another, than it was going to be for me to wrap them up individually or review them individually. In part because there are enough similar elements between these two books that if I were doing wrap-ups or reviews of both of them, there would be a lot of things where you would feel like I was repeating myself because, like, Kelsey, didn't you just talk about this book? And in part because reading these two books close enough together to sort of have the one in my mind while I was reading the second meant that the way that I think of these two books is sort of stacked one against the other in terms of which one I think is better. I think one of them is better than the other, and why that is. So the first book I want to talk about is going to be The Sisters of the Winter Wood, which is a debut novel by Rena Rossner, and the second is going to be Blanca Roja by Anna Marie McLemore. So first of all, these are both loose fairy tale retellings that also take inspiration from other fairy tale and folklore traditions other than the one story that they're sort of primarily a retelling of. I would say The Sisters of the Winter Wood is primarily a very loose goblin market retelling, and Blanca Roja is primarily a very loose Snow White and Rose Red retelling. But they both have a lot of fairy tale elements that come from other sources of inspiration than the story that they're a primary retelling of. I would say Blanca Roja is more explicitly a mashup, though. They are both books that are first and foremost thematically about sisterhood, and are both about pairs of sisters who have conflict, who have clashes, who have sort of fundamental differences in their natures, but who love each other very deeply. And sort of the icing on the cake is that they're both stories about animal transformations that involve transformations into both swans and bears. These are also both books that deal intimately with the characters' cultural heritages, and in both books there are instances where one of the two sisters might pass for something else. I'm going to give a bit of a summary of each book, starting with The Sisters of the Winter Wood. This is a historical fantasy novel that is published as adult but has crossover YA appeal, I think. It deals with Jewish history and takes place in a real town called Dubosery on the border between Moldova and Ukraine, to which the author herself can trace some of her family history. And this is essentially a fantastical reimagining of real events that happened in that town during the pogroms of that time period. We are reading about two sisters in alternating chapters, Liba and Leia. These two girls live with their parents in a house sort of out in the woods a little bit outside of the main town, and their family is viewed with a bit of suspicion in the Jewish community and not quite accepted because their mother is a Christian-born woman who converted to Judaism to marry their father. Their father is also a highly learned man from a different town whose views and practices as a Jew aren't necessarily exactly the same as the majority of the Jewish population in Dubosery. And of course there is a sharp split between which of the two parents the two girls take after. Liba is her father's daughter. She both physically takes after him and sort of spiritually as a very pious girl, and also someone with very strong intellectual inclinations, and she's very close with her father. And Leia takes more after her mother as a sort of more frail, flighty, blonde woman who doesn't necessarily look Jewish. We learn fairly early on in the book, so I wouldn't consider it a spoiler, that she's actually Liba's half-sister and that their father, who raised them both, isn't Leia's biological father, and Leia feels sort of restlessly out of place. Now, the event that sort of kicks off the whole book and introduces the fantasy element here is that Liba overhears a conversation between her parents and a visitor who shows up at night who comes from her father's village, and she discovers that her parents are both shapeshifters, that her father comes from a clan of bear shapeshifters and her mother from a family of swans. Their parents, it turns out, have to leave for their father's village on a potentially dangerous journey that they're not going to bring their daughters along on, and so they prepare their daughters to stay at home without them, though of course when they leave, unpredictable things start to go wrong and the goblin market retelling happens. And how the goblin market retelling happens is that there are a group of traveling fruit sellers who come to the village not only peddling impossible fruits, but also lies and hatred and anti-Semitism about the Jews in this community. The Hovlins, as they're called, are a magical representation in this book of a real historical force, which is the spread of hatred and distrust. And I think that's something that this book generally does really well throughout. The part that I thought made a lot of sort of intuitive gut sense to me as a way of using fairy tales and historical fantasy, sort of the same way as how the girls' parents' different backgrounds are represented by the animals that they can turn into, and how their family's magical history sort of represents the societal factors that determine their role in this town where they don't quite belong. Blanca Roja, however, is not historical fiction. This is YA magical realism, and Anna Marie McLemore's books all feel very small-town America in their setting, but they don't have necessarily a specific time in which they're set. This feels contemporary-ish. It's not historical. And so the use of the fantastical and fairy tale elements in here is ultimately doing something kind of different. This is pitched not just as a loose Snow White and Rose Red retelling, but as a bit of a Snow White and Rose Red meets Swan Lake mashup. There is a sort of premise of this family's history of swan transformations, where they're sort of cursed, these pairs of Del Cisne girls. This family, they always have 2 daughters, and when they come of age, the swans, the flock of swans to which one of their ancestors long ago made a promise, comes and assesses the 2 girls and will choose one of them to turn into a swan and join them. There's very little about this plot-wise that actually resembles the story structure of the ballet Swan Lake, but it sets up a scenario that sort of insists upon the competition between 2 girls to remain human. And it addresses how these 2 sisters ultimately undermine that assumption. I would say that a main thematic focus here, something that McLemore is clearly trying to address with this novel, is colorism in Latinx communities. Blanca is blonde and can pass for white. Roja, on the other hand, cannot, and so the people around these 2 sisters make a lot of assumptions about them, and sort of Blanca is cast in the role of the fairy tale princess, and Roja in the role of, you know, the bad girl, the rebellious girl. Like Sisters of the Winter Wood, each of these girls is more strongly attached to one of their parents. Blanca is her mother's favorite, and Roja is her father's favorite. And like the Sisters of the Winter Wood, this sort of kicks off when the parents head out of town. These sisters also live in a house sort of outside of town in the woods, ironically. But the parents head out of town and sort of leave the girls to their fate. But very insidiously, there's this piece of information that's been passed on to Blanca and then to Roja that one of these two girls can save herself from the Swans by getting a blue-eyed boy, and because Blanca is the one who passes for white, it is assumed that she is the one who can achieve that. And obviously this is all sorts of messed up. And that's the other thing this sort of takes from Swan Lake, the broad concept of two girls fighting over a guy with the stakes of a swan transformation in the mix. But this is definitely something that deconstructs and messes around with that, which is why I don't feel so much like this is a Swan Lake retelling plot-wise. But I'm giving less of a plot synopsis for this book than the other one because it is a much less plot-driven book. Anna Marie McLemore's writing is very atmospheric, very elegant, very heartfelt, but it's less of a plot-driven type of writing. The Sisters of the Winterwood tries to have a sort of poetic thing going on. Leia's chapters are actually told in verse. I didn't think that was as incredibly effective as it might have been. I don't think Rena Rossner is a great poet. The attempt there was, I think, to make Leia sound like she's a little bit more detached from the realities, the mundane things that Liba is more concerned with. It sort of accentuates the differences in their personalities, and it sort of shows how Leia is sometimes perceiving things in a different way from Liba. She is sometimes more in touch with the magical side of happenings, while Liba is more in touch with the more tangible side of things, and so they're not necessarily perceiving what's happening the same way. And I do think that worked to an extent, but the writing of this poetry is sort of just like kind of more vague prose with some line breaks thrown in. And it also meant that Leia's chapters had, it felt like a whole lot less text than Liba's. It meant that the book read very quickly because it looks like this, her chapters. And so there's a lot of blank space on the page, and this book in hardcover, it looks pretty chunky. This is an ARC copy, but it does read very quickly. So I have mixed feelings about the poetry in this. Basically, I get what it was going for, but I wish it had been better poetry. I think it was also meant to be an homage to the source material, The Goblin Market, which is a poem by Christina Rossetti. But McLemore's writing is just always elegant. The extent to which this is a Snow White and Rose Red retelling has to do, to a certain extent, with the character who is the, quote, blue-eyed boy that Blanca is told she should get for herself. In the fairy tale, the two girls who are very different from each other, but who are both presented as good girls, one of them isn't the bad girl in that fairy tale, are visited and befriended by a bear who turns out by the end of the story to be a prince in disguise. Hence the bear transformation in this book as well. There are not two but 4 point of view protagonists in this book. 2 of them being boys who've gone missing from town under magical realist circumstances and end up staying with these 2 sisters and being the love interests. These are both books with significant sort of YA romance-ish plot lines. I like Anna Marie McLemore's romances better than most YA romances. I think she just writes relationships in a really beautiful, lovely way, as opposed to sort of the hemming and hawing and vague, misdirected angst of some other books. I will be getting to the romance plotline in Sisters of the Winterwood a little later. But these 2 boys are Barclay, whose chapters are headed with the name Yearling for the yearling bear that he turns into, and Paige. Barclay is a kid from a pretentious, wealthy family. Paige is his friend. In terms of the representation in this book, Paige is a transgender boy who is comfortable with either he or she pronouns, just so long as you're very clear that she's not a girl. And Barclay has lost eyesight in one of his eyes and is dealing with a new visual impairment disability. So at the beginnings of their storylines, Barclay is escaping something that has gone down with his family that's clearly horrific, that we learn more of over the course of the book, and he disappears into the woods, and the woods sort of claim him, and he vanishes, and Paige follows him, and the same happens to her. And they each end up sort of being turned into animal characters in fairy tales that represent or mean something to each of them. And the way that this book deals with fairy tales is different from Sisters of the Winterwood in that it has a more meta approach. These characters are aware of the fairy tales that they are embodying. Barclay is turned into a bear, specifically the bear from Snow White and Rose Red, because as we later learn, that is a particular fairy tale that means something to him. Paige is turned into a representation of a different fairy tale altogether that also means something very specific to her. And this is where this book is a little more than a mashup of two stories. These characters are aware of how their stories have resonance with a variety of different fairy tales, and there are a number of different fairy tales both referenced in the book and by the characters. I think there's a similarity that struck me, though, between the transformations that the boys in Blanca Roja go through and the families of shapeshifters in the Sisters of the Winterwood. This book employs a sort of similar fairy tale logic where if people transform into something, it is because there is something that they need to become, there is something that they need to do in their stories that shape enables. In Blanca Roja, there are very personal reasons why the two boys become the animals in different fairy tales. In this, we learn a bit of the history of these two clans of shapeshifters. There is a fairy tale logic here where if you need to fight something, you might turn into a bear. If you need to flee something, you might turn into a swan. And that's, again, the very strong historical parallels between all of the fantasy elements in this book and all of the historical elements, because, of course, with what happens in this book and in history, there are going to be reasons for these two girls who have inherited these abilities to need to be able to fight or to need to be able to flee. So now I think it's time to move on to a bit of a gripe I had with both of these books, but more with this one than with this one. They both use sort of the miscommunication trope or lack of communication trope, which is, it can be one of the more annoying ways to build conflict in a book. I'm going to start with Blanca Roja because this one is going to be easier because there's less of it in here to talk about. This does do the thing where there is a divide that happens for a large portion of the book between these two sisters who, you know, have grown up so close and they've always told each other everything and they've always thought they were going to, you know, defeat the Swans together, where Blanca has done something that she hasn't told Roja about and has done it to try and save Roja, but Roja sees that Blanca is keeping secrets from her and assumes that she's betrayed their, you know, sisterhood forever. And that is sort of the primary conflict between the two sisters in this book, and it is resolved as soon as they talk to each other about it. But in this book, it did not get on my nerves as much as some of the things in this book did, and in this book it's more surrounding the romance storyline. Although there are some other separate instances as well. So in both of these books, both sisters have romance storylines, but the main romance in this book, the primary romance, is between Liba and a boy in town named Dovid, whom her father would not approve of because, as she's recently sort of pieced together, her father is waiting to be able to marry her off to someone from his bear clan. And as the daughter of the bear people's next rabbi, she will have, you know, much higher social standing for a much better marriage with them. And she has always, you know, believed that she was going to marry whoever her father picked for her, but she's sort of having this realization that no, maybe she doesn't want to marry a bear clan shapeshifter person, you know, maybe she wants to stay in Dubosery and marry someone she really likes here. So all that to say, she's developing this sort of forbidden attraction, and she is absolutely dead certain that he won't love her if he learns that she can turn into a bear. There is, I will admit, something very reasonable about this concern, but she is sort of constantly receiving this stream of affirmation from Dovid and his family, that everything about her that she associates with her bear identity, to do with, you know, her appearance, her body image, her personality traits that are faintly bear-like, that she also is dealing with sort of some self-hatred is a bit too strong of a word, but she's dealing with her own identity over it, and they're telling her that all of these things are loved and welcomed in their family. So we move on, we would think, to the fact that, oh, this will be very weird to try to reveal to these people that there's this magical thing going on. But she doesn't quite get there. Like, she's still back on, oh no, he will hate that I'm a bear. It never really gets to the point where it's about, oh no, will he believe in magic and shapeshifters? Like, it almost gets there, but like, then she's back. Once I thought she was over this already several times, into, oh no, he will hate that I'm a bear. And I'm like, Liba, can't we just like get over this little angst hill and like move on to the next one? But no, we cannot. The other thing that is sort of a miscommunication to enhance the conflict, to create conflict in the story that happens, is sort of blatantly, obviously set up in a really contrived way at the beginning of the book, where before the parents leave, the mother has a talk with each of her two daughters, and she tells them each something different about, you know, their family history and what they need to look out for, and mostly she tells each of them what they need to look out for to protect the other one. So what she ends up telling Liba is, the Swans may end up coming for your sister. I have tried to protect her from them until she is old enough to know that she has the right to choose whether to go with them or not. And what she tells Leia is, your father is going to want Liba to marry one of the bears. She should know that she has the right to choose whether that's the path she wants or not. And it's sort of the same message to both sisters, but she doesn't tell Liba, oh, you also have the right to choose whether you want to marry a bear or not. Leia, the Swans might come for you. You have the right to know whether or not you want to go with them. And this is just very, very blatant facepalm material, because aside from the mother telling each of these girls what things to look out for their sister, which is all well and good, like, there is no reason except for plot and miscommunication angst between the two sisters as the book goes on, for her not to have given each of the girls the advice that that particular girl also needs for herself. Because of course what happens first is not that the Swans come for Leia, she gets seduced away by the Hovlands and is unable to give Liba the advice that she needs and the advice that Liba was given about Leia no longer quite applies. So this is where I felt, I think, the most like I was experiencing debut novel roughness. I think I see a lot of potential in Rena Rossner's storytelling, especially as a historical fantasy writer, as someone with a passion for fairy tales who has interesting ways of wanting to tie those stories to real-world history and lessons. But it's some of that storyline roughness and angst and contrivedness that makes this feel like a less accomplished book to me. This, on the other hand, is Anna Marie McLemore's fourth novel. I have read all of her books except her debut, The Weight of Feathers, so everything I've read by her has felt exceptionally polished. I would say that my favorite book of hers is still Wild Beauty, which was the book published prior to this one, but everything of hers that I've read so far has been a 5-star read for me, and this is no exception. One of the things that I liked that this book did that her previous books that I've read haven't really done is that sort of explicit, on-the-surface deconstruction of fairy tales in a sort of meta way. That's something that she clearly set out to do in this book that is new and different from her previous books. In When the Moon Was Ours and Wild Beauty, there were definitely lots of sort of fairy tale references hidden throughout. There was a lot of sort of fairy tale-esque imagery in both of those previous books of hers that I read, but this is something that's explicitly sort of talking about fairy tale structure and storytelling, and I loved seeing that as the front and center focus of this book. Also, this didn't fit in anywhere else in this video, but I would be remiss in not pointing out that in terms of the representation in this book, there are a pair of side characters in this book who are queer lady grandmas in love, and they are a power couple and awesome. The Sisters of the Winter Wood was still a 4-star read for me. Anything with this sort of historical fairy tale fantasy attitude just checks a lot of my boxes, and I will happily enjoy things in this style that are considerably more subpar in their writing than this was. So I enjoyed this a lot. I read it quickly. I thought it did some great things with fairy tale ideas and history, but it's not my new favorite, and I do think that this author has some room to improve in future novels. So that was sort of what I thought of these two books in comparison with one another. They are both absolutely so on brand for me in so many ways. Let me know if you have read either of these and what you think, or if you're planning to. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. Happy New Year. That is all. Bye for now.